In argument theory, the Toulmin model is one model for teaching argument, creating a common vocabulary and introducing students to that vocabulary and helping them to understand how we formulate effective arguments. Stephen Toulmin was a logician. He studied logic, and he became interested in what we call practical argument rather than theoretical argument. We'll come right back to those terms. But the basic foundation, simplest foundational idea in logic is the idea of the syllogism. And one example of that, a common example of that, is the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So we have the major premise, all men are mortal. We have the minor premise, Socrates is a man, and then the conclusion that all men are mortal. And that would be an example of theoretical rhetoric, theoretical argument. In theoretical argument, this is idealized argument that results in universal truths using deductive reasoning, like in that example we just talked about. If all men are mortal and if Socrates is a man, then we can deduce that he is mortal. So as an example, a way of dealing with a question in the world is if we have the major premise that we should always tell the truth and the minor premise, John tells us a secret and we promise not to tell, then the conclusion should be self-evident, right? We won't tell John's secret. In an idealized argument, it would work that way. Now, practical argument, what Toulmin was interested in is how we reason through information and reach conclusions when we can't rely on universal truths. And so practical argument doesn't use deductive reasoning, but it looks towards probabilities, recognizing that context matters, that conclusions may vary based on the context. So for instance, same major premise, we should always keep our word. Same minor premise, John tells us a secret and we promise not to tell. But in this case, we have to consider the context. John's secret is that he committed a crime. And as a citizen, we feel obligated to report him. And we know that in doing so, we could ease the suffering of those involved. So the outcome may change. Even though the major and minor premises are the same, the outcome may change because the context matters. So he was curious and wanted to theorize about how we deal with practical argument. So he establishes the vocabulary and the ideas of the Toulmin model. And the first essential parts of the Toulmin model are the claim, the support, and the warrants. Now, and this is the vocabulary that we use that you'll see in textbooks for composition 2, argumentative writing. And it's the vocabulary that we use in our class. So the claim is easy. It's essentially the thesis. The claim is the conclusion that you want the reader to reach after engaging with your argument. The data or support is the evidence that we use. It's the logic, emotion, and credibility of our sources that helps the reader reach that conclusion. It is evidence for our claim, in other words. Warrants are a little more complicated. Students find them very complicated. They often think that they are more complicated than they really are. But warrants are the bridges between the claim and the support. It could be prior knowledge. It could be a value system. It could be assumptions that we expect our readers to share in order to reach the conclusion. Okay, so in our syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If we were really making this argument, we would probably say, well, Socrates is a man, therefore he is mortal. We wouldn't feel the need to point out that all men are mortal. But if we left that part out, we would be assuming that our reader already knows that, already believes that to be true. And as a result, we don't need to say it. But in that argument, the major premise is the warrant. Okay, that the warrant serves that purpose. If we were to make an argument, I often use the example in class of anti-smoking advertisements, the ways in which we try to encourage people, especially young people, to quit smoking or to never start smoking, often relies on health data. You know, smoking can cause cancer, smoking kills. And so we assume that that is going to be persuasive for young people. And I often ask my 18-year-old students if death is one of their greatest concerns. And they say, no, we think we're immortal. So perhaps that may not be a warrant that would be the most effective warrant in convincing young people not to smoke. So in our arguments, if a student makes an argument based on faith, they are making the assumption that their reader shares their faith, and they're making the assumption that they interpret that faith in the same way and reach the same conclusions. And that is a risky warrant, because the reader may not share the writer's faith, or they may have reached different conclusions based on their reading of Scripture. So Toulmin says that any argument is only as strong as its weakest warrant. When we build an argument based on a flawed assumption or inadequate, assuming the reader has adequate information, and the reader may not have adequate information, they may not have the prior knowledge and background information that they need, we are risking the success of our whole argument. So that's why students need to be aware of those assumptions. Sometimes it is more effective, rather than trying to get them to understand the concept of the warrant, sometimes it's more effective to deal with them one-on-one, asking them, what value system do you think your reader needs to have? And do we need to clarify that? Do we need to address that? Do we need to provide background knowledge to help strengthen the argument? He also identifies these other elements of argument that may or may not be present. So there will always be claim, there will always be support, and there are always warrants. There may or may not be rebuttal and qualifiers. Rebuttal is anticipating oppositional arguments, instances where we may acknowledge that our argument will not hold. Under certain circumstances, it may not hold, or addressing those oppositional arguments in the body of our text, in which case rebuttal also serves as support. We can have rebuttal as one element, one component of a paper, or we can have an entire rebuttal argument. The paper itself may be in response to an opposing claim. Qualifiers are ways of acknowledging the limitations of our argument, they're ways of narrowing the scope of our argument. So if in the case of all men are mortal, that argument is not qualified. It is universalized. And there are instances where arguments can be and should be universalized. But there are also instances where they should not be, because universalizing the argument will weaken it, because one exception undermines the whole claim or the whole piece of support. So students often feel like if they acknowledge exceptions, then they are weakening their arguments. We have to help them understand that they are actually strengthening their argument. So don't smoke. That one probably doesn't need to be qualified. And so that's an instance where a universalized argument, an argument that is meant to apply equally to all people, would be relevant. But in other instances, there may be qualifications that are relevant. For instance, a lot of students want to write about college athletics and that college athletes should be paid. And we might need to narrow the scope of that argument to recognize that at many universities, college athletics are not profit generating. They actually are fully funded by the university and cut into the university's budget. And so we could qualify that argument by narrowing the scope and acknowledging that perhaps athletes in profit-generating sports at profit-generating universities should be paid, rather than offering a claim that really does overstate the issue. Now, this is one of the examples that Toulmin offered, and I want you to read this and think about it. How Toulmin was less concerned about the conclusions that we reach. He was more concerned with how we reach them, how we think, what are the warrants that will influence our decision, what kind of data or support will we consider as we make this decision. So I want you to think about here, not necessarily the outcome, but what would influence the decision, what data would be necessary to influence the decision, what warrants would affect the outcome.